So I just have a few slides on postmodernism. I usually would throw postmodernism and post whatever all together, but I've decided to split it up this time. So we have postmodernism. Postmodernism began somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s is kind of everybody's guess. And we'll go to the next slide. The thing to think about with postmodernism is that paired relationship. So functionalism and conflict theory are paired. Functionalism is the discussion of the parts and the functions and stability, and then conflict theory says, well, great and thank you for labeling everything, but stability should not be your end game, because some of the most stable societies, like caste systems and slave systems, have some of the most dramatic incidences of inequality. So it's like conflict theory was a reaction to functionalism. And then we have symbolic interactionism. That's something completely different, looking at meaning and structure, and meaning and living within the structures, and construction of reality and all that good stuff. And then postmodernism is a reaction to symbolic interactionism, in a sense. It's the idea that if symbolic interactionism requires shared meaning, do we really share meaning, or do we have a whole bunch of different meanings? Is there one meaning in there, or do we have all of these different groups finding their own experiences? And then we've had a shift yet again, especially with the development of smartphones and the internet. Our society has changed yet again in roughly 2005. So postmodernism is going to be mostly in the mid-80s to about 2005 is when you're going to see most of the postmodern work come out. There is some stuff from the 1960s into the 70s that is considered to be postmodernism, but a lot of people were doing symbolic interactionist work at that same time, or conflict theory work. So we're going to focus on just the postmodernism for a minute. So before we talk about postmodernism, what's modernism? That's the big question, right? So modernism is the modern industrial age. So started in the late 1700s with the Industrial Revolution. Functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism all existed within the modern age. They were developed within the modern age. They were studied within the modern age, defined within the modern age. They believed very strongly in science. They believed very strongly in objective truth. That even that idea of social construction, the idea that reality is decided upon, doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't truth. Just because we may not know the average height of a human male from the beginning of time to today, because we can't dig up all the bodies and lay them out on the ground and get their average height, it doesn't mean that that number doesn't exist as an abstract conceptual truth. There actually is a number that represents the average height of the human male from the beginning of time to today. So in the modern age, there was this search for and hope that as we had the social construction, that the social construction would lead us to whatever truth is. That's a huge part of modernism. And some of that delved into postmodernism a little bit. The big difference there is that the modern system really depended on science. Science was the final arbiter of truth. But going into postmodernism, they kind of stepped away from science a little bit and was looking at, well, how else can we see truth? How else can we view truth? Can it be in literature? Can it be in the stories and songs and poems that people tell about themselves? Can it be in music? Can it be in rock and roll? Can it be anywhere? Where is truth located? Kind of changed with postmodernism. So if we start out saying that science was the most important thing in the industrial age and in the modern system, postmodernism says, well, not really. If you think about science being the almighty leader, then maybe math and engineering would be underneath it, and then maybe the social sciences, and then maybe literature and philosophy and ethics and stuff down on the bottom. In postmodernism, we collapsed the hierarchy. We said that knowledge was as leaves on the ground. The French philosopher, I can't pronounce anything in French, but Lyotard, I believe is his name, was talking about the leaves falling from the trees. So you no longer have science reigning supreme. You have all intellectual knowledges being equal. So if you want to learn about, say, African American studies or African American experience in the United States, you wouldn't necessarily go to science and find a whole bunch of statistics of this percentage of people does that and this percentage of people do that. Instead, you may go to critical literature. You may find some poetry written by African Americans in the 1800s and the music of the slave period and the food of the slave period, and critically analyze that as a reflection of reality at the time. And that was seen as a valid way of gaining knowledge. Now, what we've had, though, is the disciplines are still curators. So critical theory got to write papers and peer review. If sociology is trying to explain, one of my master's thesis was on the lived experience of HIV. So yes, we listened to people with HIV, hours and hours and hours of interviews, but I and my fellow investigators took all of that knowledge, curated it, made it into a paper, and then presented it and said, this is what people say. That's a big element of postmodernism that's very different from today. The decline of the grand narrative. You don't have Karl Marx explaining all of humanity from the hunters and gatherers to today, saying that it's all about surplus and a two-class system. And we're not doing all of human history anymore. We're doing little pieces of human history. And do we have shared meaning, as we were discussing? If symbolic interactionism depends upon shared meaning, do we really have shared meaning? So some of the big themes of postmodernism is that science gives us way more questions than answers. It seemed like science was going to be great because science was giving us things like Listerine and cleanliness and hygiene, and they figured out where cholera came from, and we got antibiotics. Like, oh great, this is wonderful. And then science gave us human cloning. Well, what do we do with that? Are we going to do human cloning? Should we do human cloning? So science is giving us a lot more questions than we have answers for. That bright light of progress is fading. If I were to be teaching a class in the 1960s and I were to ask my students, so you think your children's lives are going to be better than yours? In the modern period, most people are going to say, oh yeah, of course, because the world is going in a positive direction and my children's lives are going to be better than mine. Well, if I ask you guys that today or in the 90s or into the 2000s, probably not. We're probably not going to say that's automatically going to be. It doesn't mean that it can't be, that your children's lives cannot be better than yours, but we don't have this enduring hope, I guess, that it's always going to get better. Because we feel like modernity failed us. All the cool stuff that the modern life was supposed to bring us, flying cars, robots that cook supper, all that good stuff, modernity has failed us, and none of that is here. We still have inequality, we still have poverty, we still have child hunger, we still have school dropouts, we have everything. All the things that humans have always had, we still have those things, even with science. Cultural debates were intensifying in the postmodern age, and they have hit warp speed since then. And social institutions also changed during the postmodern age and have hit warp speed since then.